But today's speaker, have you ever had to defy your parent or grandparent because you knew you were right and you closely loved and respected them your entire life? Now, what if that grandparent were the adored and deeply regarded United States Secretary of State, George Shultz, whose wisdom guided our national policies to end the Cold War? Now, just to amplify the intensity, what if that defiance would surely topple the darling of Silicon Valley, the pride of investors, including your grandfather, dethroning the chosen role model of women entrepreneurs worldwide with a valuation of over $9 billion? Well, our speaker was hired very young at Theranos under Elizabeth Holmes, and after his haunting departure, is currently the CEO and co-founder of Flux Biosciences, which utilizes magnetic sensing to bring the power of medical grade in vitro diagnostics into the homes of consumers and patients. So let's have a genuine, real deal, authentic welcome for Tyler Shultz.
Thank you. Thanks so much for that intro. I like everyone's attire, so I had to run and grab myself some so I could fit in.
Now, what I did was we talked a little bit and said, how would you like to do this? And he's going to tell a little bit of the story, but I'm going to get us rolling with just a couple questions, okay? Can you tell us a little about when you first met Elizabeth Holmes and getting hired at Theranos? And what kind of vibe did you get from her?
Yeah, definitely. So I first met Elizabeth in my grandfather's living room, actually. And I was a junior at Stanford University at the time, and my grandfather lived and worked on campus. So I just got a phone call from him, and he said, something like, I have this brilliant woman coming over to my house, and I think you would learn a lot if you came and joined our discussion. And I had like almost no other context. So I biked over to his house, and I went into his living room. And that's when I saw Elizabeth for the first time, and she was wearing her all black outfit, the black turtleneck, so she was dressed like Steve Jobs. I heard her extremely deep voice, her piercing blue eyes, and that's when I heard her lay out a vision that I would later hear her lay out dozens and dozens of times, which was she had invented a technology that could do anything that a central laboratory could do, but with just a single drop of blood from the finger. And even better, this could be done anywhere where you had power. So it could be done in an operating room, in a helicopter, in a battlefield, in a drugstore, in a patient's home. So it really sounded like the technology had no limits. And on top of that, she also had this very impressive story where she dropped out of Stanford when she was 19 years old to start this company. So she very much had modeled herself after people like Steve Jobs. And in that meeting, I realized that it was something that I had to be involved with. So I stayed in touch with Elizabeth afterward, and eventually went and did an internship there after my junior year. In that internship, I never even worked with a Theranos device. So I was working in a research lab where we were developing antibodies, which is just one small piece of what would be used in the test. But no one that I was working with had ever seen a Theranos device. And I was working with people who had been there for several years and they had never seen one. And from my internship, the biggest thing that stood out was how seriously they took their non-disclosure, trade secret, confidentiality agreements. And it was so intense that even within the company, you weren't supposed to tell other people about what you were working on. They were in stealth mode for, I think, like 11 years. So the world didn't know what they were working on. There were locked doors, there were barricades, there were tons of security. Elizabeth, everywhere she went, she was followed by security detail. So the big takeaway from my internship was they take secrecy extremely seriously. Wow. Yeah, so then I left, and the only red flag on during my internship was when I left, a woman that I had breakfast with who worked in a different lab said, you should not come back here. You should leave and go learn how to do real science somewhere else. So that was the only real red flag that I saw while I was working as an intern. So I went back to Stanford, finished up my senior year. And then when I came back to Stanford, my first day was the day that they actually launched their first wellness center in Walgreens. So this was the first time that they came out of stealth mode, that they told the world what they were working on and actually launched the product. So it was very exciting. But also on my first day, it was the last day of someone who ran the lab that validated the test to make sure that they were safe to use on real patients. And so she apparently went on vacation and she said, don't launch the product, it's not ready. And when she came back on this day, the product had been launched. So she had some kind of confrontation with Elizabeth and Sunny, and then she was out in the parking lot crying. And I remember a scientist just came by telling us like, hey, Tina's out in the parking lot crying. If you want to say goodbye, you should rush out and do that now. And then my team manager pulled us aside, my research team aside, and she said that she kind of gave us the inside scoop that even though we quote unquote launched the product, that we didn't have any tests validated on the platform. So patients would go into Walgreens, get their blood drawn, and then we would drive it back to Theranos and we would ship it to labs at UCSF or elsewhere, or we would run the test on third-party equipment inside Theranos. So even though we launched the product, it wasn't a true launch. The product wasn't actually being used. And that meant that the team that was in charge of validating these tests was working around the clock to try to get these tests validated so that they could be run on the Theranos product. And I was told that at one point that team was like 20 to 30 people, but by the time we launched this product, it had shrunk down to about 8 because the working conditions were so bad. People were literally working through the night. The president and COO of the company, Sunny Balwani, would do walkthroughs of the lab at 3 a.m. to make sure that people were working. It was just a really intense working environment and people were constantly quitting. And because of that, a couple days after this product launch, we got an email from Sunny essentially shutting down all research labs and putting everybody into assay validation. So they just needed more people working in that lab. And that's when I started working with the Theranos device. And pretty quickly, you can see that things are not all that Elizabeth has promised. As part of our kind of like onboarding into that lab, we were shown a version of the product that didn't have the plastic shell on it. So you could see exactly what was inside and you could see what it was doing. And the first time I was seeing this was the first time that my manager from the research lab was seeing this, who had her PhD and postdoc from Stanford. So she was someone who I really respected. And we watched this, and I remember Aruna turning to the woman who was giving us the demo, and she just said, "Do you think this is cool?" And the woman giving us the demo shrugged her shoulders and said, "I'll let you decide for yourself," and walked away. And at that moment, I realized that there was almost like an inside, kind of like an inside joke or like an open secret that the technology didn't actually exist, because what we saw was a pipette on a robotic arm. And a pipette is the most common piece of lab equipment in the world. There was no new signal transduction method. There was no microfluidics. It could only run one test at a time. It wasn't even a standalone platform. You had to use centrifuges and robots before you could actually put the sample into the Theranos device. So there were some logistical problems that you could see right off the bat. If you had looked at the inside for 2 minutes, you could see that this was not going to work out. And then when we actually started using the product, we realized that on top of that, it didn't even work very well. And my specific job was to actually calculate how much variation there was in results. So I would take one sample and run it 60 times and then calculate how much variation there were in those 60 replicates. And on our website, we advertised that the coefficient of variation for our tests was less than 10%. And coefficient of variation is essentially like a standard deviation, so the lower the better. And when I was actually running the test to calculate that, I never saw less than 10%. I rarely even saw less than 20%. And then on top of that, I was seeing some other red flags where my colleagues who were working in the CLIA lab, where they were actually testing real patient samples, were saying that quality controls were failing, but management would force employees to run tests anyway. So to me, that was like, we were getting clear evidence that the test wasn't working and we were choosing to run the tests regardless. And then when we had to get our CLIA certification so that we could actually, from a regulatory perspective, have the ability to run these tests. The CLIA inspectors came to look at our lab. And when that happened, we were told not to go in or out of the lab that had the Theranos product. And those inspectors were only shown third-party equipment that we bought from companies like Roche and Siemens. And so I thought that was really strange that the inspectors were not shown the Theranos product. And then we essentially participated in a safety inspection where a third party sends a sample to the lab. You test that sample the same way you would test a patient sample and report the results back. And then that regulatory agency sees if you got the answers right. And when we got that sample, we split it and we ran it both on third-party equipment and on the Theranos product. And in some cases, the results were off by more than 300%. And so when that happened, we made the decision to report the results from the third-party equipment, even though at that time there were 7 tests that we were running on the Theranos product. And that didn't make any sense to me because it seemed like if Tesla had to do a safety inspection, they basically took a Ford and drove through the safety inspection at the end, said, hey, great, we know how to pass a safety inspection. But if you're not selling Fords, you're selling Teslas, I don't see what the point of that exercise is. So these red flags were popping up. And for me, the kind of the straw that broke the camel's back was a test we were developing for syphilis. And I was doing these precision experiments and I saw that our coefficient of variation was 43%, which means that the standard deviation was 43% of your expected value. So there was a lot of variation. And then we tested samples that were known to be positive for syphilis, and we only got 65% correct. So that's like if we tested 100 samples known to be positive for syphilis, we would tell 35 of those patients that they did not have syphilis. And we essentially said, okay, that's not good enough. And we had bad scientific methods and we pretty much deleted that data set and we tried again. And the second time we got 80% correct. And then we tested, we did a study where we would test sample from the arm versus the finger prick. And for that study, we actually collect samples from our colleagues and from ourselves. And when we did that, an alarming percentage of Theranos employees tested positive for syphilis. And I remember we just laughed. And I remember the manager of that validation lab looked at us and just went, guys, it's not impossible. And we all just laughed. No one sent out a company-wide email saying like, hey, you might want to go get tested. I personally participated in that study and I never questioned my own syphilis status. We all just assumed that the test didn't work. And so anyway, we compiled all of that data and we gave it to the biostatistician team, expecting them to say that this data is terrible, it does not pass our standards, we can't run this test on real patients. Somehow it passed validation. Our medical director gave it the stamp of approval and they said, okay, we're gonna start testing real patients for syphilis. Someone can walk into Walgreens, prick their finger, and we will give them their syphilis status. And to me, it felt like, when I heard that news, I felt like I got punched in the stomach because I felt like we had so much data that proved that this test did not work, and we were going to choose to run that test anyway. And syphilis is one of those diseases where if you go get tested and you test positive and you get treatment, it's really not that big of a deal. But if you go get tested and the test says you do not have syphilis, then 1, you can continue spreading it. And 2, if you let syphilis go untreated, it can eventually become a life-threatening disease. So this felt extremely serious to me. And I thought, okay, I have to start raising my concerns because I literally can't sleep at night. So I approached Elizabeth directly with just a couple of my concerns. So I said, 1, I'm the person who's actually running the test to calculate coefficient of variation, and I never see less than 10%. And that's what's advertised on our website. And secondly, a lot of statistics that we calculate in our lab don't match what ends up in the validation report. Because in the validation report, it said that our syphilis sensitivity was 95%, which meant that if we tested 100 people for syphilis, we would have gotten 95% correct. And in reality, we got 65%, then 80%, and then all of a sudden, in the documentation, it said 95%. So I questioned what happened there. And she just kind of said, oh, that doesn't quite sound right. Let's take a look at the website together. So I went around to her side of the desk. She pulled up the Theranos website, and in big bold on the homepage, it says coefficient of variation less than 10%. And then in smaller writing underneath, it says vitamin D only, or it says vitamin D. So she says, oh, that's only meant to apply to our vitamin D assay. It's not meant to be indicative of our assay performance as a whole. And about the statistics mismatch, I'll set you up with a meeting with our vice president who oversees the statistics team, and he can explain to you what happened there. So those seemed like pretty reasonable answers to me. So I left her office and I went back to my desk and I pulled up the validation report for vitamin D, and the coefficient of variation was 19%. And we actually tested it for 3 levels, and I think the 3 levels were like 17, 19, 23. So kind of like around 20%. So even for that specific assay, the claim on our website was not true. And then I went and I had these meetings with the vice president, and I asked him about how the 80% or how the 65% became 80%, became 95%. And what he told me was that they employ what's called an equivocal zone, where they say, we don't know the answer. And then they run that test on third-party equipment. And those samples don't count in their calculations. They're essentially removed from the calculation. And what he told me was, and I remember these words like it's a photograph in my mind. He said, we want to report 95% sensitivity. So we expand the equivocal zone until we get 95% sensitivity. And I thought that was one of the dumbest things I'd ever heard, because if you wanted to report 97, you could do that. If you wanted to report 100, you could do that. And I also pointed out that once we expanded that equivocal zone to be 95%, that there were more samples inside that equivocal zone that we discarded than we actually made a syphilis diagnosis for. So I said, what is the point of running this test at all if in the majority case you have to throw the samples out and test it on third-party equipment? And he said that that was essentially a business decision that had been made. So I was pretty frustrated by all of this. And so I ended up writing I wanted to meet with Elizabeth one more time, but she started avoiding me, which was really weird for her, because by this point, she was almost like part of my family. She was coming to our family Christmases and birthday parties, seeing my grandfather more than once a week. When he went to his family day at the Bohemian Club, he would bring Elizabeth rather than someone from his own family. So she was really like we were becoming really closely tied, and she started avoiding me. And eventually she said, why don't you just write all your concerns in an email and then I'll address them. And that turned out to be a really good thing, because I went through my points one by one and just said, here's an observation, here's data to report it or to support it, and here's what I think we should do to address it. And I did that point after point after point. Probably wrote like a 5 to 6 page single-spaced email about all of my concerns, and I sent it to her. And she did not respond, but the president, who's also on the president COO / Elizabeth's boyfriend, responded. And he essentially said that I was arrogant, ignorant, reckless, patronizing, and had no basic understanding of math, science, or statistics. And that if I had any other last name, that I would have already been held accountable in the strongest way. And essentially he wrote me that email hoping I would quit. And that's exactly what I did. I sent them an email saying, okay, consider this my 2 weeks notice. This isn't where I want to work. And later that day, I met up with my manager. I gave all I transferred my lab notebooks, told him about all the experiments that I had done, what I had planned. So I transferred all my work over in a very professional way. I met with the head of HR. I signed some more non-disclosure agreements, and I left. And when I left, my mom called me and she said, this is like before I even got to my car, right between the Theranos door and my car in the parking lot, my mom called me and she said, stop whatever it is you're about to do. And I said, it's too late. I already quit, and they're definitely not going to let me go back in. So that ship has sailed. And she said, that's not what I'm talking about. Elizabeth called your grandfather and told him that you vocalized a vendetta against her. And if you executed that vendetta, you will lose. And I said, I have no idea what she's talking about. I've been just like hanging out in the break room all day long. I haven't been doing anything today. So I went over to my grandfather's office, and just to figure out what was going on. And he said that Elizabeth told him that I quit in a very dramatic and inappropriate way, and that she was trying to meet with me, but that I was refusing to meet with her, which was so far from the truth. So I showed him the email exchange that I had. I tried to reiterate these points, that we're only running a few samples or a few tests on the Theranos product. Everything else is done on third-party equipment. He said, Elizabeth has assured me that every test is run on the Theranos product. They only have third-party equipment for validation purposes. They're going above and beyond what's required of them by the regulatory agencies, blah, 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 blah. And he essentially said he didn't believe me and that I should move on with my life. So I left his office, a little bit frustrated, but overall just feeling extremely relieved that I was finally out of this toxic situation. But it was hard to move on because she is still coming to my family events. So after this happens, I go and I have Thanksgiving dinner with Elizabeth. And it's not like there are 100 people at Thanksgiving and Elizabeth just happens to be one of them. It was my grandparents, my parents, me, Elizabeth, and her parents. That was the entire guest list. So it was extremely awkward. And my parents didn't even want to go. They said, we can't go to Thanksgiving dinner. We have to protest. And I said, that is exactly what Elizabeth wants. If we don't show up, then she wins. So we have to go. So I forced my parents to go to Thanksgiving dinner with her. And overall, it was pretty unremarkable, but she gave one pretty creepy toast where she raised her glass and said, I just want to say that I love and appreciate every member of the Shultz family. And I thought that was just like the creepiest, like, I don't even know how to describe that moment. I still can't believe that it actually happened. But I remember raising my glass and my hand was literally shaking and I was staring at my hand, just like begging it to stop shaking so I wouldn't spill my wine. And shortly after that, because that was obviously in November, and then in April, at that point, I had gotten a new job at Roche, and I was contacted by a Wall Street Journal reporter on LinkedIn, and he was asking some questions about Theranos. And I tried to ignore him. I talked to my former managers about it. I talked to my parents about it. Everyone said, don't talk to him. They said, how scary Theranos can be. They have a ton of money. They have this powerful board. It's great that someone's looking into it, but you should stay out of it. So I tried to do that for about a month. And then I got really curious about exactly what he knew. And so I just kind of got curious. So I ended up wanting to connect with him. So I went and I bought a burner phone with cash, thinking that I would be able to stay anonymous forever. And I called him, and it turns out he knew a lot. So he had a lot of information, and he actually had a source. His main source was actually the former medical director. So he had someone who was way above my pay grade giving him information. And he was really just looking for corroborating sources. And in that phone call, I felt like he was the right person to break this story. He had won a Pulitzer Prize in the past. He specialized in healthcare fraud. He had this really great source. So in that phone call, I decided that I wanted to be a source for him. And I told him, my grandfather was part of the Nixon administration during Watergate. He was part of the Reagan administration during the Iran-Contra scandal. And he made it out of both of those with his integrity completely intact. So I'm confident that if the truth about Theranos is exposed, that he's going to do everything he can to make things right with the people Elizabeth has hurt, and he will make it out of this Theranos scandal with his integrity intact. but he's 95 years old. So I don't know if he's going to be around forever. So I want to give him that opportunity sooner rather than later. So that was one of my motivations for working with John. So I ended up sending him the email exchange that I had with Elizabeth and Sunny. I told him pretty much everything that I knew. And about a month afterwards, I went to have dinner with my parents, who lived about 25 minutes south of me. And my dad had just gotten off the phone with my grandfather. And he said, "Have you been speaking to a Wall Street Journal reporter?" And I said, "Yes, I have." And my dad was furious with me because obviously we had discussed it. He told me that I shouldn't talk to him. And I said, "There's no way Theranos actually knows that it was me. I did my research on this reporter. He's won a Pulitzer Prize. He's not just going to go give away the names of his sources." So I called my grandfather and he said, "Tyler, tell me what's going on." And I said, "I have no idea. You tell me what's going on." And he said that Elizabeth told him that I was giving trade secrets away to the Wall Street Journal. And once they published those trade secrets, they would no longer be defendable. So in order to show that they defended their trade secrets, they had to have me sign a non-disclosure agreement saying I wouldn't disclose anything moving forward. So that didn't completely make sense to me, but I said, yeah, I'm happy to sign a non-disclosure agreement because I have no plans on disclosing things moving forward. And he said, "Okay, great. How about you come over and meet with the Theranos lawyers tomorrow morning?" And I said, "I'm happy to meet with the lawyers tomorrow morning, but before then, can I please just come talk to you without any lawyers around?" And he said, "Yeah, sure, come on over tonight." So I left my parents' house and I briefly went back to the house that I was renting with 5 friends in Los Altos. And I come in and I'm totally panicked, and I tell one of my housemates what's going on. And he said, "Okay, well, when you go over to your grandfather's house, are you going to tell him the truth?" And I said, "Yes, I've always told the truth. I just want to keep telling the truth. And I believe that if I do that, things will work out for me." And he said, "Dude, you should definitely lie." And he had a really good point, because he essentially said, "I don't know what's actually on the table. I can always decide to tell the truth if I want to. But once I do, there's no going back. So I should go over there and collect information and really look out for my own interests before I decide to tell the truth." And I thought that was actually a pretty good idea. So I went over to my grandfather's house and I told him that I have not spoken to the Wall Street Journal. I don't know why Theranos thinks that I have. And I again reiterate all my old points. He reiterates all his old points. Theranos is going above and beyond what's required of them, all that stuff. And so we're having an unproductive conversation. Eventually he just says, "Okay, whatever the case may be, will you sign a 1-page non-disclosure agreement?" And I said, "Yes, I'm happy to sign that." And he said, "Well, there are actually 2 lawyers here right now. Can I go get them?" And I was completely blindsided, completely unprepared. But I said, "Yeah, sure, go get them." So he left to go get the lawyers. And my step grandmother was there as well. And she turned to me and said, "Henry Kissinger thinks this is all fake. He thinks the box doesn't actually exist." And I was just like, yes, why is nobody listening to Henry Kissinger right now? He was on the board of directors and had the same concerns that I did. But for some reason, all the pressure was being put on me, a low-level former employee. But anyway, these lawyers come down, and they do not give me a 1-page non-disclosure agreement. They give me a notice to appear in court on Friday morning, and this was on a Wednesday night. They gave me an application for a temporary restraining order, and they gave me a strongly worded letter signed by someone named David Boyce, who I had never heard of. And obviously, I can tell that this is not a 1-page non-disclosure agreement. So things get pretty heated between me and the lawyers. They're saying that they need to get information from me. They need me to retract things that I said to the journalist, that the journalist had been manipulating sources, and that I could say that I was manipulated, and he was misogynistic and all this stuff. And I just kept saying, "No, I have not spoken to the Wall Street Journal." They said that it was their jobs to figure out who the sources were, and it took them 5 minutes to figure me out. And I just kept saying, "I think you're wrong. I haven't spoken to the Wall Street Journal." And eventually my step grandmother's looking really uncomfortable. So I asked her, I said, are these lawyers making you uncomfortable? And she said, yes. So I turned to the lawyers and I said, okay, you're making my grandmother uncomfortable. This conversation needs to end. And they kept pressing me. And at that point, I just shut down and I completely stopped responding. And eventually my grandfather got really frustrated and he stood up and said, okay, you guys got to get out of the house. So he shooed them out of the house. And then he came back and said, okay, can we just call Liz? Can we invite Elizabeth over so we can have a direct conversation with her? And I said, no, please no. I'm way too tired for that right now. And he said, okay, we'll just call her instead. So he called her and said, we were trying to have a discussion, but you sent over litigators. Tomorrow, I want you to send over different lawyers, and I want you to send the one-page non-disclosure that we had discussed. So I come back the next morning, and of course, the same two lawyers come, and they do not come with a one-page non-disclosure agreement. They come with an affidavit that essentially says, my name is Tyler Shultz. I'm 24 years old. I have not spoken to the Wall Street Journal, but here's a list of names of people who I know have. And then it says under penalty of perjury, and then there's a line for my name. So I know I don't want to sign this because even though I don't know what an affidavit is and I'm not a lawyer, I know that I don't want to commit perjury. So I know I don't want to sign this. So I tell them there's no way I'm going to sign this because I don't want to list names of people who I think have spoken to the Wall Street Journal. And things start to get pretty heated again between me and the Theranos lawyers. So my grandfather physically separates us and puts the lawyers in the living room, and I'm in the dining room. He's going between the two rooms, negotiating this affidavit. And eventually the Theranos lawyers take out the part about listing names of sources. And so my grandfather comes back and says, hey, great news. You got what you wanted. You don't have to list names of the sources. And to me, it felt like they were just kind of like calling my bluff there. So I had to come up with another reason to not sign it. And I said, I have a notice to appear in court tomorrow morning. And as far as I can tell, I can sign this affidavit and I still have to show up in the courtroom. So I want there to be a sentence in here saying that Theranos won't sue me. So my grandfather in pencil wrote, Theranos will not sue Tyler for 2 years. And I said, 2 years is not long enough. And so he crossed out 2 years and wrote forever and brought it to the Theranos lawyers. And I thought there was no way they would agree to that. But surprisingly, they agreed. My grandfather came back very happy, said, hey, you got everything you wanted. Now sign it. And I couldn't think of a new reason to not sign it. And I pretended to read my old confidentiality agreements, just trying to think of more reasons to push back against this NDA or against this affidavit. And it felt like every single person in the room knew I was lying, and I was just going to be making their day by committing perjury. So eventually I just said, Elizabeth has had lawyers look at this with her best interest in mind. So now I want to have a lawyer look at this with my best interest in mind. And my grandfather looked really frustrated when I said that. He said, okay. And he asked if his personal attorney said it was okay to sign, would I sign it? And I said, sure. So he went to go fax this thing to his attorney. And I went into the kitchen and started flipping through his contact books, trying to find the attorney's phone number. And luckily, my step grandmother came into the kitchen and slapped a piece of paper with a number written on it and said, go call him. So I went outside and I called the lawyer and I said, my grandfather's about to send you something. He's going to tell you to tell me that I have to sign it, but you have to tell him that I cannot sign it. And he just kind of went, whoa, what? Slow down a little bit. So I slowed down and he said, okay, who's representing them? And in my hand, I had the letter signed by David Boyce. So I said, they're being represented by someone named David Boyce. And he said, holy shit, do you know who that is? And he listed off all these high profile cases that he'd been involved with Napster versus the US government, and I think also Microsoft versus the US government. He led the legal team in charge of passing Prop 8, which legalized gay marriage in California. He was the Clintons' lawyer. He's Harvey Weinstein's lawyer. He's the lawyers of people that you don't want to mess around with. So he knew that I was in trouble. So I he said, okay, you have to come to my office in San Francisco right now. So I went and I talked to the Theranos lawyers and said, this lawyer says I need to go meet with him in San Francisco. And they said, okay, we'll let you leave, but you have to be back here at 2 o'clock. And so I went and I met with my lawyer, and they just kind of said, there's no way you're going to go meet with them at 2 o'clock. And they negotiated on the phone with the Theranos lawyers all day. And at the end of the day, we could not come to any kind of an agreement. And I went to bed that night with a notice to appear in court the next morning. Luckily, I woke up to an email saying that Theranos called it off and they were going to give me more time to negotiate. And at that point, it started this cycle where Theranos would set a court date for me. We would negotiate these ridiculous affidavits. We wouldn't come to agreement. We were about to go to court, and then they would call it off. And it would just start over and over and over. And it was like that for about 3 or 4 months. I ended up spending between $400,000 and $500,000 in legal fees. They hired private investigators to follow me. It got to the point where my parents were begging me to just sign the affidavits, just whatever it is they want me to sign, just sign it. It wasn't my responsibility. And they said, if this goes to court, we will, the best case scenario is we will pay $2 million to win. That's the best case scenario. And they said, we will sell our house to pay for those legal fees, but please do not make us do that. Just sign the affidavit and move on. And I couldn't do it because all I could tell them was the affidavits are not true. They want me to sign things that are not true. And I'm not supposed to talk about the details of the affidavits, but essentially they would say, my name is Tyler Shultz. I'm 24 years old. I'm a really bad person who is vindictive against Theranos, and I made things up to hurt them. And I'm not going to sign that because it's just not true. But eventually the Wall Street Journal publishes their report, their first article in October of 2015. And some of the pressure is kind of let off of me. And after then, it's just a very slow unwinding. In 2018, the SEC finally comes out and with a report, with an investigation, and they say that Elizabeth was guilty of a massive years-long fraud. They found instances where she was telling investors that their revenue was $100 million when in reality it was $100,000. So it was extremely black and white. But it really wasn't until like 2018, 2019 that my grandfather finally realized that Elizabeth was not this brilliant Steve Jobs character revolutionizing the world. And he finally came over to my side of thinkings. But by that time, it was, that was pretty late in the game. And she's still awaiting her criminal trial. It's supposed to happen in March, and I hope it actually does, because the court date's been pushed for like over a year now. So I'm just ready for this whole thing to get wrapped up.
Wow, thank you. Oh, awesome. Hey, quickly, I noticed this little ring right here. Is that pretty new? And congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, this is it's very new. So I got married about, I think, 3 weeks ago.
You think?
Yeah. So, yeah, it's funny. We were like really good friends in college. We actually lived together after college, but never dated. So it's funny. We've known each other for like 10 years, but only started dating like 3 to 4 years ago. And yeah, finally tied the knot during the pandemic, which is fun.
You spoke well of her in your wonderful audiobook, and great job. And now,
thank you.
Questions, everybody. And Jim, if you could be the ringleader, we'd appreciate it. And I do want to point out, fabulous. I don't know if you call it a podcast or an audiobook, what you had. You had us riveted on it, driving along, my wife and me, on Audible. So.
Oh yeah.
It was great. Anybody wants to check it out, it's fabulous.
Thanks.
First question is from Fred Stambaugh.
So Tyler, fascinating story. And as Buddy said, riveting. The first question that comes to my mind is, did this technology ever really work on anything?
So it depends on how you define work. It was basically, it's old technology that was just slightly changed. So it kind of works, but it can only run one test at a time, but it doesn't work very well. So like it was very poorly engineered. Like tips would fall off in the middle of tests. The door sometimes wouldn't close. The barcode scanner didn't work. It had all kinds of problems. So I would say, no, it didn't really work. There were times when like you could have a day where you would have this lucky day where things seemed to work, but it would never be capable of running a blood test in a medevac helicopter or in an operating room. That would never, ever happen. And one of the really frustrating things was like when I would talk to my grandfather, like the night before the Theranos lawyers kind of ambushed me, he said that these devices were currently being used in medevac helicopters and in operating rooms at UCSF, and that the surgeons at UCSF told him that it was revolutionizing the field of surgery. And I just said, like, there's no possible way that can be true. Absolutely no possible way that's true. Because I was working with them and they barely worked inside the walls of Theranos. There's no way these are being used on battlefields and in medevac helicopters. And at one point, Elizabeth had even invented a quote from Jim Mattis, who was on the board of directors, and put it on their website, on the Theranos website. And you can find archived versions of this that say, these Theranos devices are deployed in arena in Afghanistan and Iraq, Jim Mattis. And so she's just like inventing all kinds of crazy stuff. And that's completely untrue. And I think the board of directors really dropped the ball, especially like Jim Mattis. If someone invents a quote like that from someone who was about to be the Secretary of Defense, puts it on their website, and you're on the board of directors, like, come on, that is, I don't know what that is. Negligence is a nice word.
She certainly bamboozled a lot of people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She was good at something.
Skip McCowan, do you have a question?
I do. Tyler, I have a couple of questions, actually. As a lawyer who has represented pharmaceutical companies for most of my career, and always worried about the smoking gun email that the plaintiff's lawyers would find about something our company was doing, I found it unbelievable to learn that she actually asked you to put in an email all of your concerns. And so my question is, did you do that? And is that Exhibit 1 in the upcoming trial?
Yeah, so that turned out to be just an amazing, amazing thing for me, that she actually requested that I put my concerns in writing, and I did that. And not only did I do that, but I even got a response in writing from the president of the company. And I think that Elizabeth I think people give her way too much credit. I think people think she's really, really, really smart. Even still, I think people think she's a really smart person. And I'm not so sure, because that is really stupid. Like, that is a really stupid thing to request that these types of things are being put in writing. And yes, I expect it will be Exhibit 1.
I have two other questions. Is David Boyce still involved in representing the company?
He is not. So he was a board member and also the general counsel, and eventually he resigned from both of those responsibilities. But
what other notables were on the board besides Boyce and Henry Kissinger and Mattis?
Let's see, Sam Nunn, Kovacevic, who was the CEO of Wells Fargo, Riley Bechtel, CEO of the Bechtel Corporation. I can't remember all of I think they had more politicians, but I just can't remember who they all were off the top of my head. But they also had some really big name investors like Rupert Murdoch and Larry Ellison and Robert Kraft and Betsy DeVos and the Walton family from Walmart and the Cox family. So she had some big names involved there as well.
Tyler, Peggy Cabanis has a question. Did you or your grandfather ever talk with Henry Kissinger directly about this?
I never did. The only time that I was with Henry Kissinger in the context of Theranos was at Elizabeth's 30th birthday party, where he read her a limerick that he wrote, where the punchline was, "You're not the next Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs was an earlier you." And that I so vividly remember that birthday party because it felt like all of these board members were treating her like she was the prettiest girl on the playground in middle school or something. They were not treating her like a CEO. They were treating her like a daughter that they kind of had a crush on. And it was really gross.
Rich Shear?
Really gross. Wow, that's a anyway. You're describing the sense, okay, the tension of leading up. You've got a court hearing tomorrow, or they're trying to get you to sign your affidavit, and then they say, okay, fine, we'll put it off, and then that pattern repeats. Yeah. At some point during that, over and over and over again, did you get a sense that maybe they were kind of bluffing and they didn't think their position was as strong as they were trying to make you think it was? Because it sure smelled that way to me.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what was happening. In retrospect, I kind of wish we had played it differently. I wish we had just said, yeah, let's go to court. We're not going to talk to you anymore unless it's in a courtroom. I wish I had said that because, yeah, I don't think they ever wanted me to actually go to court, put me under oath, and have me tell the story that I just told you. I think that would have been a disaster for them. There's no way they would have wanted me to do that. And we also learned that it was basically their strategy was to just get me to spend all of my money until I couldn't afford good lawyers anymore. So yeah, I do wish that we had kind of played that a little bit differently, but what are you gonna do?
Well, hindsight is 20/20. You did just fine.
Yeah, thanks.
David Wall?
Tyler, thanks for your presentation. You got thrown into the wolves and handled it fairly well. So my question is, what have you been doing since then? I mean, I imagine your life plans have changed a little bit besides getting married. Congratulations. But what are you doing now and what are your plans?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So after I left Theranos, I went and I worked at a lab at Stanford with an old professor that I had who had essentially repurposed old computer hard drive technology where you have magnets flip up and down to store zeros and ones to do diagnostics. And it's kind of, a lot of people think I'm kind of crazy for wanting to stay in diagnostics, but Elizabeth sold it so well on this vision that I'm still chasing it. And I always thought that if you actually had a technology that could do some of these things, even like a small fraction of the things that Elizabeth was claiming, that it could be great. So I went and joined this lab at Stanford, and I think I found a technology that actually can do some of the things that Elizabeth was claiming. So I ended up working in that lab for about 3 years, and developing a point of care version of this technology that is very sensitive, it is quantitative, it's multiplexible, it can be used in point of care settings. So it has a lot of the same promise that the Theranos product did. And we spun out into a little startup where we are focusing on an initial application of applying this to female fertility. So it would be a product that women could have at home, where they would test their urine for a panel of hormones that would, one, predict when they're ovulating, but more importantly than that, it will collect deeper information on their ability to get pregnant and actually diagnose the #1 cause of female factor infertility, which is having a cycle that doesn't produce an egg. And what we would like to do is connect those women directly to telehealth providers who can prescribe a really cheap, safe, and effective treatment called Clomid, which stimulates ovulation. And so we would like them to be able to take that treatment, again, just from home through a telehealth provider, and use our product to monitor that treatment to see if it's working or not. And oftentimes what happens is women have to spend a year without success before they can even go see a fertility specialist. Then the fertility specialist will order blood tests, which costs, between like $800 and $1,500. Oftentimes insurance policies don't cover fertility services. This is being paid for out of pocket. maybe they discover this, and even if they don't, this treatment, Clomid, is often the first line of defense against infertility, because it just increases your chance of getting pregnant because it stimulates the ovulation event. So yeah, essentially we're hoping to make that process more efficient, cost less, so that more women can have access to this type of fertility treatment.
Chris?
Yeah, and then we'd like to replicate that model for other conditions as well.
Chris, you have a question?
Well, actually, David Wall asked the question I was going to ask, but, I just wanted to ask just personally, are you jaundiced at all when it comes to the South Bay research and biopharma community?
Not really. Yeah, so I don't know if it's just because I'm a very optimistic person, and yeah, it's just part of my personality, but I just think that so many things had to go wrong for Theranos to happen that it just pretty much can't happen again. Because if you think of all the systems that failed, it's like the board of directors failed, the investors failed. No investor ever saw a single audited financial statement, which is mind-blowing that someone can raise $1 billion and not give anyone an audited financial statement. The media failed, the employees failed, the regulatory agencies failed, and they were all designed to fail by Elizabeth. And it just seemed like all of those things had to fail for this to happen. And I don't know. I just don't think that there are any other companies that have designed all of those systems to fail the same way that Elizabeth has. But I don't know. There is a lot of stimulus money out for, to address COVID. And I know that there were a lot of kind of like bad players, at least in the diagnostic space, kind of in the early days, because the FDA essentially got rid of all regulations. They said, we need products as fast as possible. So there's almost no regulation to release these products. And quickly found out that there were a lot of defective diagnostics out in the space. So then the FDA had to kind of reel things back. So there are certainly companies out there looking to take advantage of situations, but I just don't know if it can be at the same magnitude as a Theranos.
Okay. Hey, thank you.
Got two more questions. Ernie, you're up next.
Yes, with all the evidence that seems so overwhelming and damaging, is Elizabeth so disconnected from reality that she thinks she could win in a trial? And why hasn't she accepted a plea deal at this point?
I do not know, because her latest defense is an insanity plea, which I never thought they would do something like that, because an insanity plea essentially is an admission of guilt. It's saying I did something wrong, but I have an excuse for it. And I'm not so sure she's gonna win that argument. I really don't know how this is gonna play out, but it does seem logical that if you make an insanity plea that you're probably gonna lose, you might as well just settle. But I don't know enough to know the strategy behind that, but it seems, for lack of a better word, it seems kind of crazy to me.
George?
Your grandfather seemed to have played a fairly central role in your whole story. Who is your grandfather, and what are his feelings about her at this present moment? Will he be testifying? I don't know who he is. You refer to him, and he's obviously well placed.
Kidding.
Involved in the industry, whatever.
Sure, yeah. So my grandfather is, he's held the most cabinet positions in the history of the United States. He's held 4 different cabinet positions. He was the Secretary of Treasury for Nixon, and he was the Secretary of State for Ronald Reagan. He was also the CEO of Bechtel Corporation for a while. And yeah, so he now works at Stanford at the Hoover Institute. And when Elizabeth got him, he got a lot of his high profile friends like Jim Mattis and other former secretaries of state to join the board as well.
Will he be
Okay,
required to
Conrad,
testify in the
you.
trial?
I'm not sure if he'll be required to testify in the trial. I would imagine so. But I don't really have a whole lot of insight into that trial. Like I learned things in the news just like everybody else. I know it wasn't until just like a couple weeks ago that I was requested to be a witness, which I thought was surprising because I know that they had sent out subpoenas a long time ago to other witnesses and I just never got one. So I thought maybe for some reason they didn't want me to testify, but a couple of weeks ago I learned that in fact they do want me to testify. So I know I'll be in the trial, and I would expect the board of directors to be witnesses as well.